Africa's relationship with China was in the spotlight this week as Senegal hosted the 2021 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. A number of new investment deals were announced.
Can you clarify with whom the U.S. is speaking with China? They're saying it's fake news that trade talks are happening.
Well, they had a meeting this morning, so I can't tell you. It doesn't matter who they is. We may reveal it later, but they had meetings this morning, and we've been meeting with China. And so I think you have, Jeff, as usual, I think you have your reporting wrong. Thank you very much. We'll see you.
Decolonization was more or less the forgotten continent. Western countries did not want to engage it for whatever reason. China went in. China treated every African country as brother and sister, and China really invested hugely in Africa. Now, many other countries are talking about engaging with Africa, including the United States, many European countries, India, for example. The more the better, because Africa should not be a monopoly for any other country, not for China, not for anyone else. Africa is for the African people.
Midnight over the Gulf of Guinea. Tankers line the horizon like a chain of floating cities, their lights glowing like fireflies. But these are not Western tankers. They fly no American or European flag. They belong to Africa. They belong to China, and they are quietly rewriting 100 years of global energy politics. For decades, the U.S. dictated how the oil game was played. Prices were set in Washington and New York. Supply chains were policed by U.S. warships. The dollar was king. But now, for the first time in modern history, the balance of power is shifting, and it is shifting fast. In the heart of Africa, from Nigeria's delta to Angola's offshore platforms, something extraordinary is happening. African oil is no longer being shipped exclusively to the West. It's being traded directly with China, India, and the global South, often bypassing the US dollar entirely. It is being refined locally, creating jobs and wealth right where the oil is drilled. The profits are no longer being siphoned out of Africa. They are being reinvested into African roads, African railways, and African futures. Washington is panicking. Reports from think tanks and intelligence agencies admit, in unusually blunt language, that America's dominance over global oil is under direct threat. This is not fear-mongering. This is not speculation. This is happening right now, and the numbers are staggering. Chinese-backed refineries are coming online at lightning speed. Joint ventures with African national oil companies are locking in decades-long supply deals that guarantee stability for African producers and predictability for Chinese buyers. New shipping routes are bypassing the traditional choke points patrolled by Western navies, reducing the leverage Washington once had over global trade. This is not just an oil story, it is a sovereignty story. It is about Africa finally using its oil to build power, not just sell power. It is about African governments demanding to be more than just suppliers, demanding to be shareholders in the wealth their land produces. And the symbolism is not lost on anyone. Every new refinery ribbon-cutting ceremony is a signal to Washington. Africa is taking back control. Every pipeline built by African hands is a statement that the continent will no longer be hostage to foreign middlemen. Meanwhile, in Washington, the panic button has been pressed. Lobbyists are flooding Congress with demands to re-engage Africa. Policy papers warn that the petrodollar, the backbone of U.S. economic power since the 1970s, could be severely weakened if African and Chinese oil trade continues to move away from dollar-denominated contracts. Imagine this: oil priced in yuan, oil contracts signed in Nairobi or Luanda instead of Houston or London, and entire African regions setting their own benchmarks for crude. This would mean U.S. sanctions lose their sting. It would mean Washington's ability to pressure countries by controlling access to its currency would evaporate. It would mean, for the first time, Africa would have leverage over the West, and it doesn't stop there. This oil strategy is bigger than barrels. It ties into ports, railways, pipelines, and power grids being built across the continent. It is creating a self-reinforcing system that makes Africa and China more interdependent and the West less necessary. This is why some in Washington are calling it a geopolitical earthquake. They understand that what is at stake is not just oil profits, it is the very architecture of global power. This is why tonight's speech matters, because this is not just an African story. It is a global story, a story about the end of an era, the rise of a new alliance, and the way Africa is finally using its natural resources to dictate its own destiny. We are standing at the edge of a historic transformation, a transformation that could determine who controls energy, who controls finance, and who controls the future. So stay with me, because in the next few minutes we are going to break down exactly how Africa and China have built this oil strategy, why Washington is so terrified, and why, no matter how loud the shouting gets from the West, the world is about to change forever. The world is witnessing an energy revolution, and it is not happening in Washington, London, or Paris. It is happening in Africa. For decades, the narrative has been that Africa must remain a supplier of raw materials, shipping its oil out to Europe and America for cheap, then buying back refined products at 10 times the price. That model has kept African nations poor, dependent, and weak. But that model is dead, and what is rising from its ashes is a partnership so powerful, so strategic, and so disruptive that it could shut the United States out of Africa's oil future forever. For the first time in history, African oil producers from Nigeria to Angola, from Gabon to Congo, from Ghana to Senegal are sitting on the same side of the negotiating table as their buyers, and sitting right beside them, with pen in hand and billions of dollars ready to deploy, is China. This is not just about selling barrels of oil, this is about rewriting the entire architecture of the global energy trade. Imagine this: China's state-owned oil companies and Africa's national oil corporations pooling their resources, jointly building massive refining complexes on African soil. No more shipping crude across the ocean. No more being told what the price of your own resource should be by traders in New York or London. No more waiting for loans from Western banks to build pipelines and storage tanks. Instead, Africa and China are designing a system where the entire value chain — exploration, drilling, refining, petrochemicals, even distribution — happens inside Africa. This is industrialization at a scale the world has never seen, and it is shaking the foundations of U.S. energy dominance. Washington is in panic mode because it understands what this means. It means U.S. oil companies will no longer have privileged access to African crude. It means Wall Street traders will no longer be able to manipulate oil prices to squeeze African governments. It means the Pentagon will no longer use energy security as leverage to influence African foreign policy. Let's be clear, this is not charity from China. Beijing has made a cold, calculated decision. Africa is the future of energy, and whoever secures Africa's energy future will hold a major piece of global economic power. China's Belt and Road Initiative is not just about roads and ports, it is about locking in long-term energy partnerships that guarantee supply for Chinese industries, while building prosperity for African partners. Look at what is happening right now. Massive Chinese-built refineries are coming online in Nigeria and Angola. Pipelines connecting landlocked producers to coastal terminals are being financed with Chinese credit, and new oil fields are being developed with joint African-Chinese technology, bypassing Western oil field services entirely. The United States is terrified because this is not just about oil, this is about independence. Every barrel refined in Africa is a barrel that doesn't create jobs in Texas or Louisiana. Every petrochemical produced in Africa is one less reason for African nations to import from Houston or Rotterdam. Every dollar of oil revenue that stays in Africa strengthens African currencies, African banks, African governments. This is why U.S. officials are flying to African capitals, warning about debt traps and strategic risks. But Africans are not listening because for once they have leverage. They are no longer desperate borrowers. They are partners. They are sitting across from Chinese negotiators with a shared vision: build Africa into a global energy powerhouse. This strategy is deeper than most realize. It is not just about today's oil, it is about tomorrow's energy transition. China is helping African nations invest in downstream industries, plastics, fertilizers, fuel distribution, so that when the world eventually moves away from fossil fuels, Africa will not be left with stranded assets. Instead, Africa will have world-class infrastructure and diversified economies that can pivot into new energy forms. For the U.S., this is an existential threat. American foreign policy for decades has relied on controlling oil, controlling who gets it, at what price, and under what conditions. That leverage gave Washington enormous power over African governments. Now that leverage is disappearing, and with it, Washington's ability to dictate Africa's choices. Consider this scenario: in the next 5 years, Africa and China finalize a continent-wide oil pricing mechanism that uses the Chinese yuan instead of the US dollar. That single move would shatter the petrodollar system that has underpinned American economic power since the 1970s. Suddenly, trillions of dollars of U.S. debt become harder to finance, the dollar weakens, and America's ability to print money to fund wars and interventions collapses. This is why U.S. think tanks are writing frantic reports about China's influence in Africa. This is why Western media is running story after story warning of geopolitical risks. Because they see the writing on the wall: the era of America as the gatekeeper of African oil is over. And let's not forget, Africa is not just a passive player here. African leaders are driving this agenda. They are the ones demanding that refineries be built locally, that technology be transferred, that jobs be created on African soil. They are the ones saying no to exploitative contracts, no to one-sided deals, no to shipping rock crude overseas for pennies while their people pay exorbitant prices for fuel. This is a new generation of African leadership, bold, assertive, unwilling to be bullied. They understand that oil is not just a commodity, it is a weapon of economic liberation, and they are using it to rewrite the rules of engagement with the West. Washington has tried every trick in the book to stop this. They have threatened sanctions. They have offered aid packages. They have tried to pit African countries against each other. But the momentum is unstoppable. When you have Nigeria, Angola, Algeria, and even smaller producers like Ghana and Senegal all aligning with China's vision, you are witnessing a continental strategy that is bigger than any single nation. The question is no longer whether this will happen, the question is how fast it will happen, and how much of the global energy map will shift before Washington can adjust. Right now, the U.S. is fighting to keep even a small share of African oil exports flowing to its refineries. But as more of Africa's production gets refined locally and sold to Asian markets, America will find itself scrambling for supply, competing on equal terms with other buyers, with no special privileges, no backroom deals. And perhaps the most significant shift of all, Africa is no longer afraid of walking away. In the past, the fear of losing Western aid or investment forced African nations to accept terrible deals. Today, they have alternatives. If the U.S. threatens to pull out, China steps in. If Europe refuses financing, BRICS banks write the check. The balance of power has changed forever. This is why we say Africa and China's oil strategy could shut the U.S. out forever, because it is not just about barrels of oil, it is about a new global order where Africa controls its destiny, where its resources are processed locally, where its wealth builds African cities, African industries, African futures. And in this new order, Washington is just another customer, no longer the master. The aftershock that tears down the entire house of Western dominance. What Africa and China have set in motion is not just a shift in oil markets, it is a tectonic realignment of global power, and Washington knows it. Look at what happened the moment the first Africa-China joint refinery came online. U.S. oil giants, who for decades had operated with near-monopoly access to African crude, suddenly found themselves competing not with other Western companies, but with African-owned enterprises backed by Chinese capital. The usual playbook of underpaying for crude, lobbying local governments for tax holidays, and shipping profits abroad no longer worked. African governments are now negotiating from a position of strength. They are saying, if you want our oil, you pay our price. If you want a stake in our projects, you build our infrastructure. And if you refuse, there is a partner in Beijing ready to take your place, one who brings cash, technology, and zero lectures about human rights or good governance. Washington is alarmed because this strikes at the heart of its soft power. For decades, U.S. influence was rooted not just in military bases, but in the ability to shape African economies through control of key sectors. Oil was always the crown jewel, a lever that allowed America to decide which governments thrived and which ones fell. But now that lever has been yanked out of their hands, think about the symbolism: African oil tankers bypassing European refineries and heading straight to Chinese ports. African ministers signing long-term supply contracts denominated in yuan, not dollars. African engineers, not Western contractors, running the most advanced refineries on the continent. This is what terrifies Washington, because if Africa can do this with oil, the most geopolitically sensitive commodity in the world, it can do it with everything else: copper, cobalt, lithium, even food production. The United States would no longer be the global center of gravity for trade. It would be just one customer among many, forced to pay fair prices rather than dictating them. The panic in U.S. energy circles is not hard to see. American oil executives are lobbying Congress to create incentives to re-engage Africa. Washington think tanks are publishing reports warning that China is weaponizing oil. Some even argue for a more aggressive U.S. military presence in African oil-producing regions to secure America's energy interests. But that ship has sailed. Africans have learned from history. They know that the U.S. military presence is not about security, it is about control. It is about making sure that no African nation can independently decide how to use its own resources. And this time, African leaders are saying no. In fact, some of the boldest moves have been made by leaders who, only a decade ago, were dependent on U.S. aid and IMF loans. Today, they are canceling those loans early, kicking out exploitative oil contracts, and renegotiating terms that keep more of the revenue in African hands. This is a revolution, quiet in some places, loud and defiant in others, but unmistakably a revolution. And China is not just a silent partner. Chinese companies are training African engineers, transferring refining technology, building storage facilities, and even co-developing oil futures markets that compete directly with the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. If this trend continues, and all signs say it will, Africa will become not just a producer of oil but a price setter. Imagine that oil prices determined not in New York, London, or Dubai but in Lagos, Luanda, or Dakar. That would mean African nations could manage production to stabilize their own economies rather than being hostage to Wall Street speculators. It would mean they could shield their currencies from shocks, invest more consistently in public services, and plan long-term development with real certainty. And when Africa thrives, the ripple effects are global. Investors will flock to African markets, infrastructure will boom, the middle class will expand. But for the United States, this prosperity poses a challenge. It cannot compete under these new rules. America's model has always been about extracting maximum value with minimal investment. In local development, that model cannot survive in an Africa that has tasted sovereignty. So what does Washington do? It launches smear campaigns. It accuses China of neocolonialism, an accusation dripping with irony given the West's own history on the continent. It pressures African leaders behind closed doors, warning of sanctions or loss of trade preferences. It tries to pit African nations against each other, spreading rumors that one country's deal will hurt another. But this is not the Africa of the 1980s. The level of continental solidarity is unprecedented. Regional blocs like ECOWAS and the African Union are coordinating energy policy, sharing best practices, and even talking about a pan-African oil company that would rival the biggest multinationals in the world. If such a company were created, and it is not far-fetched, it would instantly control a massive share of global oil reserves. Making Africa one of the most influential players in energy geopolitics, combined with Chinese financing and technology, this would effectively lock Washington out of decisions about African oil. And it is not just about exports. Africa's domestic energy demand is booming. With 1.4 billion people and some of the fastest-growing cities in the world, the continent is consuming more energy every year. By refining locally, Africa keeps prices lower for its own citizens, fuels its own industries, and builds energy security that is not vulnerable to foreign interference. For decades, America has used energy scarcity as a tool of pressure, withholding refined products, manipulating fuel shortages, and offering loans with strings attached. That tool no longer works when Africa can meet its own needs. The conclusion is inescapable. Washington is losing its grip on Africa, and it may never get it back. The more the U.S. tries to fight this trend, the faster it accelerates. Every threat of sanctions pushes African nations closer to China and BRICS partners. Every criticism from Western media only strengthens the resolve of African leaders to chart their own path. And here is the most important point. This is not just about Africa versus America. This is about a new global order where no single power can dominate. Africa and China are building a model of partnership that is based on mutual interest, and other players like India, Russia, Brazil, and even Middle Eastern countries are eager to join. In this new world, the U.S. will have to compete like everyone else. No more gunboat diplomacy. No more IMF shock therapy. No more backroom deals that favor multinationals over African citizens. This is why this story matters. Because what is happening in Africa is not just a regional shift, it is a preview of the future. A future where power is shared, where resources are processed at the source, where nations rise not by begging for permission but by seizing opportunity. And in that future, America must make a choice: adapt or be left behind. For Africa, the path is clear. It will no longer be the raw material warehouse of the world. It will no longer be the energy filling station for others while its own people live in darkness. It will no longer be the pawn in someone else's geopolitical chess game. Instead, Africa is becoming the player, the one moving the pieces, the one calling the shots, the one shaping the endgame. And for the first time in living memory, the oil beneath Africa's soil will serve Africa's people first, not Washington, not Wall Street, not Brussels. This is why we say Africa and China's oil strategy could shut the U.S. out forever. Because it is not just a deal, it is a declaration that the age of dependency is over, that the age of African submission is over, that a new era has begun. And in this era, the world will no longer ask what Africa can do for them, they will ask what they must do to earn Africa's partnership. What we are witnessing today is not just a shift in oil markets. This is the complete reprogramming of global power dynamics, and it is being led by Africa, with China standing shoulder to shoulder as a strategic partner. For over a century, Africa was treated as an endless supply depot, a place where foreign powers could come, take what they wanted, pay pennies on the dollar, and leave behind poverty and division. Oil was the centerpiece of this exploitation. African crude flowed to Western refineries while African villages sat in darkness. Western corporations posted record profits while African governments were told to tighten their belts. That era is over. Today, Africa is rewriting the rules. No longer a passive supplier, Africa is now a value creator. Oil is no longer simply drilled and shipped, it is refined, processed, and turned into prosperity at home. Local jobs are being created. Local engineers are running complex refineries. Local governments are collecting revenue that funds schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. And this is what makes Washington nervous. Because for the first time, Africa is no longer dependent. Independence is not just a political slogan, it is an economic reality. When Africa refines its own oil, it no longer needs to beg for finished fuel from foreign suppliers. When Africa sets its own prices, it can stabilize its own markets and protect its own citizens from price shocks. But the real earthquake is the partnership with China. This is not just about money, it is about technology transfer, training, and strategic alignment. China has given Africa the tools to stand on its own feet, and Africa has provided China with a secure energy future. Together, they are building a system that bypasses Washington's control. This is why you see panic in Western media. This is why think tanks in Washington are warning about a new oil axis. This is why politicians are scrambling to offer Africa trade deals and incentives they never considered before. They know the old game is collapsing and they know they are losing. Let us be clear, this is not about anti-Americanism, this is about fairness. For decades, Africa was told to play by the rules of the free market, but those rules were designed to keep Africa at the bottom. Every time Africa tried to rise, there were sanctions, coups, debt traps, or political pressure to push it back down. But now Africa has partners who will not sabotage its growth, partners who see Africa not as a charity case, but as an equal. The results are already here. Trade between Africa and China has surpassed $300 billion annually. Dozens of new refineries and petrochemical plants are under construction. Oil contracts denominated in yuan are becoming the norm, and African leaders are sitting at the negotiating table not as junior partners, but as decision makers. For the United States, this is a wake-up call. The era of unchecked dominance is finished. The petrodollar system, which gave Washington immense power over global trade, is under direct challenge. If Africa and China succeed in building a robust oil trading network outside the dollar, it will send shockwaves through global finance. Imagine a world where African nations no longer need to stockpile US dollars to buy fuel. Imagine a world where oil-rich African states reinvest their wealth into Pan-African infrastructure instead of foreign banks. Imagine a world where African energy decisions are made in Accra, Luanda, and Addis Ababa, not in Houston or Washington. This is the future taking shape right now, and it is a future where Africa holds the pen and writes its own destiny. But make no mistake, this transition will not be easy. There will be resistance. There will be sabotage attempts. There will be propaganda campaigns to paint Africa's rise as dangerous or unsustainable. But Africa has been here before, and this time Africa is not alone. With China, BRICS, and a growing coalition of Global South partners, Africa has the diplomatic and financial backing to withstand the pressure. And so, the message to Washington is clear. The world is changing. The monopoly is over. If America wishes to remain relevant in Africa, it must come not as a master but as a partner. It must compete fairly, respect African sovereignty, and abandon the old tactics of coercion. Because whether Washington likes it or not, Africa's oil will serve Africa first. And if the United States cannot adapt to this new reality, it will find itself watching from the sidelines as Africa and China build the next chapter of global energy history. The final word is this: Africa is no longer waiting for permission. Africa is no longer waiting for foreign aid. Africa is no longer waiting for validation from the West. Africa is moving forward, with or without Washington. And as the oil flows, so does the power flowing away from the old capitals of dominance and toward a continent that has waited too long for its moment. That moment is here. That moment is now, and nothing, not sanctions, not threats, not propaganda will stop it. This is how Africa and China's oil strategy shuts the US out forever. Not with bullets, not with bombs, but with a simple truth. Africa will no longer be exploited. Africa will no longer be controlled. Africa will no longer be silent. The world had better get used to it.